deal struck in Geneva has been hailed as a positive step in ending the crisis. Despite this, the U.S. announced plans to send additional non-lethal military assistance to Ukraine. By the way, that's mostly food for Ukrainian troops. Just how close are we to resolving this conflict? For analysis, I'm joined now by Jorge Benitez, director of NATO Source. Why don't I kind of piggyback off a couple of the things that our correspondents just talked about. Kate Parkinson in Donetsk, she said she talked to some of these people who were in the buildings. Are you going to come out now? Their attitude, no. In fact, she has not been able to verify it. But there are reports that they've actually gone to the airport to try and seize it. So you can gather a lot of foreign ministers, I guess, in a room. They can sign a bunch of documents, but that doesn't necessarily translate into action, does it?
No, and that's one of the most problematic things about this agreement that was reached in Geneva. Can it be enforced? Will it be implemented? Right now, Secretary Kerry is depending on the Russians to take care of the disarmament of the pro-militia groups in eastern Ukraine.
So you asked those two questions. What's your answer?
I believe that I don't think the Russians, what's taking place in Geneva is their most sincere. I think the comments that you saw coming out of Putin in Moscow, those are the clearest and most sincere expressions of what Moscow is thinking.
We have in this agreement that the monitors with the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe will be tasked with helping to implement this. How much leeway are they going to have? How difficult is it going to be for them to actually get in and try and help make this thing a reality?
It's going to be extremely difficult for the OSCE observers to do much because, as we saw in Crimea, they were physically kept out of the problematic areas. Some of them were warning shots were fired over their heads. Plus, we must remember that Russia is part of the OSCE and can veto anything or any actions by the OSCE monitors that it does not like.
The U.S. says it's going to send non-lethal aid, and Putin says, I'm going to reserve the right to actually use force. What do we read into the tea leaves coming from the United States and Russia?
From the United States, we're seeing the same tea leaves we've been seeing for a while, very gradual, very minimal support for Ukraine. From Russia, we're seeing much more provocative statements and much stronger tea leaves because Putin actually didn't say he's reserving the right. He reminded everyone, I have already been authorized by the Russian parliament to use armed forces in Ukraine.
And as Nathan pointed out, he said, Russia, this is a new Russia, more involved in Eastern Europe. So how are we to take that and translate into the wider picture?
As Supreme Allied Commander General Breedlove of NATO said, this is a paradigm shift for NATO and the Western allies because Russia has used military force to seize Crimea and is now using military force to change the political balance of power within Ukraine itself.
There aren't many levers available to the West, are there?
I think there are very few levers that the administration is considering, but I think there are many levers that could have a substantial effect. For example, if we enforced a lot of our own law enforcement and anti-corruption measures against the Russian banks, that would send a very strong message. If the Europeans stopped buying energy from Russia, that would prevent their profits from going to fueling Russian tanks in Ukraine.
So how do you see this thing playing out moving forward? I mean, we've had this agreement in Geneva, but as you point out, it may be very difficult to implement it. Where do we see this thing going from here, at least on the diplomatic stage, do you think?
I think that this crisis will not stop until the West makes some very strong measures against Russia and stands up to it. Until then, Putin and Russia will continue to be provocative and push and try to take more and more of Ukrainian territory.
But a lot of people have been saying that for some time, and there doesn't seem to be much movement there. And it also seems that everyone has to work in concert. It's not just the United States. It's in concert with Europe. And as you mentioned, a lot of these European countries rely on this fuel that's coming from Russia.
Well, there hasn't been much movement in the West in uniting behind these stronger measures, but we have seen stronger measures coming out of Moscow. So the weaker we continue to be, more and more provocative steps that we've been seeing from Moscow.
All right, George, always a pleasure seeing you. Thanks so much for coming in and giving us your analysis tonight.
Thank you.